Okay guys, so the next thing we got going on here is these are our new piston assemblies that we got from Eggy, and the new connecting rods that we bought. Now I actually was a little bit disappointed with these rods, mainly because they have new bushings in them, but I didn't realize it until I went to put these together. I thought the bushings were finished, and they weren't. They were new bushings that were pressed in, but the pins wouldn't go in. They wouldn't fit. So I had to, in addition to paying for the connecting rods, I had to set up my rod hone, and I had to fit the pins. I wasn't aware that I had to do that. The description said that the rods were finished and ready to go, and they weren't. So, but you know, that's the way it goes. So we set these up, and we ended up honing all the bushings out and fitting the pins in these, and it's a real close tolerance fit. It's about a 1/2 thousandths clearance. So but we got that set up right. Now putting the piston and rod assemblies onto the pistons. So according to the service manual, the slot, that's a heat dam slot. You can see it. There's a slot that's manufactured into the piston. That heat dam slot goes toward the driver's side of the car. Okay, so it goes towards the driver's side. Another way that you can do this is in order to get that on right, if you'll notice the bearing in here has, or the rod rather, has these bearing slots here. There's a slot there and a slot there. Those are just locating slots that you'll find pretty much on every connecting rod. There's one on the cap down here. On this side, there's a locating slot there on the cap, and then there's one on the rod up here. Those slots are both on this side of the rod. The way that you put these together is the slots over here are going to be opposite of that heat dam slot. So the heat dam slot is going to go to this side, which is the driver's side, and then the notches are going to be on this side. So just make sure that they're on the opposite side, and you can't go wrong. That's the way they all go on. Now, in order to put these together, this is what they call a full floating piston pin. It's actually a pretty good setup, and it's important that you get the piston on, because the piston is directional, and also the rods are directional in the block. It's important that you get that right, because the rod has an oil spurt hole here that is designed, oil shoots out of here, and it's designed to help lubricate the inside of the engine. So it's pretty critical that you get that right. So we're going to go ahead and put these together. I'm going to do one on camera, and then I'll do the rest of them. And also we have the C-clips that go in there. So you never want to put these together dry. You always want to use lube or some kind of oil on them. I just use engine oil. So I have some fresh engine oil here that I just took out of the oil bottle, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get some on the end of the pin, and I'm going to lube that bore up. I'm going to make sure that there's plenty of lube on that bore, and we'll get some more on the other side. We want to make sure we got plenty of lube on the bore, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a little bit of lube on this bronze bushing here. Make sure we got oil on that. Okay, just be generous with it. Don't be stingy with your oil. And then of course our heat dam is facing the camera here. So we're going to take our connecting rod and we're going to put it on with the bearing notches to this side over here, or opposite the heat dam. And we're just going to very simply, we'll get our make sure the pin's good and lubed up too. And we'll go ahead and get our piston pin started here in one side. We'll get it in the piston, right? Then we're just going to make sure the notches on your rod, the locating notches, are opposite of the heat dam here, and they are. And then you just very gently slide that pin in. The nice thing about these is you can I always say you can put together full floating piston pin assemblies on your kitchen table, right? You don't need any special equipment or anything. So, and that's basically all there is to it. Now, what we want to do is we want to get the C-clip in there. So we want to take our C-clip, and these are really easy to put in. You just, all it requires is a pair of needle nose pliers. You don't have to have snap ring pliers or anything. So there is a snap ring groove in there. So we're just going to take our needle nose pliers, and you probably want to wear eye protection when you do this, in case this thing flings off of there. Plus I can see a lot better with my glasses on. So we're just going to take our needle nose pliers and we're going to compress that so that we can slide it in there, and it's pretty easy to do. And then the one thing you want to do though is you want to make sure that that's inside the groove all the way around. Years ago, back when I knew everything, I put together a Ford motor with these, and I didn't have the clip all the way in. It came apart and it was catastrophic. So, but that was back when I was a genius in my 20s. So that's basically what it looks like. You've got the pin fits up against that like so, and you got your C-clips, and just make sure that that C-clip is in the groove. And also the opening of the C-clip, you either want that facing up or down. You don't want it side to side. They say it's a lot less likely to have any kind of a problem coming out if the opening is facing up or down. We're going to put them up, and so yeah, so then you just flip it over, and we're basically going to do the same thing on the other side. I always take another pin and I just kind of slide it in and push that all the way up against, just to make sure that I'm flush up against that C-clip. And then of course we take our snap ring and we put the other one in with the opening facing up, and you are in business. Just like so. And again, make sure you're in the groove there. So we're in the groove all the way around. The opening's facing up. And you might want to take your pliers and just kind of try to rotate that a little bit. See what I'm doing there? Just to make sure it's seated in the groove, I'm just rotating that clip. It should turn real nice in that groove. We'll do the same thing on the other side. We'll just grab onto the end of that and just give it a little bit of a turn. Just rotate it a little bit, and that's going to ensure that we're inside that groove. I've never really had any trouble with this type of sleek C-clip coming out or anything. So we're in the groove on both sides, and that is our full floating piston. Now, the next order of business here is to put the rings on. We want to take a look at the piston rings for this. I'm going to go through and put all of the pistons on here, but I won't, do that on camera, make you watch all that. I've said this so many times before. If you really want to see all 6 of these go on, just rewind the video and watch me do that one 6 times. But I mean, honestly, it's kind of silly. So, okay, so now let's grab the rings and I'll show you what we do with those. One of the things that you want to make sure you do also is, I'm going to check all these, but I'll show you. Now, in the box, it tells you 1, 2, top ring, second ring, and third ring. Now, the factory pistons on this actually has 4 rings. And I talked to Eggy about that because the replacement piston that they manufacture only has 3. Now, their explanation of that was this: the ring technology has improved so much that they've just come to the conclusion that they don't really need to have a 4th ring there. They've had 0 issues. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the ring technology wasn't very good, so they took, this is one of the old pistons that was in there, and you can see it has 2 compression rings and 2 oil rings. Well, I asked them about that, and They just said that's just totally unnecessary. Back then it might have been in the old days when the ring technology was crappy, but the rings are so much better now that it's just completely unnecessary. So, and I agree. I know from building performance engines and just some of the stuff that I've done that the ring technology is really, really good nowadays. It's much better than it used to be. So, okay, so we're going to take our oil rings. So we're going to take our oil ring expander, and the expander is spring steel, so it just goes on like that. You can just take and slide it over the ring. Now there is a gap, there's a place where the expander, it's important that this expander here, that the ends are butted up against each other. You don't want these overlapped. The way I like to put these on is once I get that expander on, I find where it's butted right there, and I come just to this side of it because this ring is going to catch the bottom of that and kind of lock it into place. So I just, and again, these scraper rails on these rings are spring steel, so you can roll them on. They're not cast iron or they're spring steel, and they're designed to roll on. So now that kind of holds that in place. Now here's your gap. There's a gap on that. What you want to do is you want to take and you want to turn that gap away to the other side. So I've got it on the other side here. For our top scraper, we want to take, and we just want to make sure that the gap on this side is opposite the other one, because that helps eliminate any possibility of blow-by or oil consumption. So you never want to line up those gaps. So now I've got a gap here, and if I go to the other side, my lower gap is opposite that. Now I have to look at my compression ring. So I have a top and a second compression ring. But before I put those on, one very important check is we need to make sure that the end gap of the ring is correct. It's really critical that you get this right. Okay guys, so now we've this is our engine here. We're going to take the ring and I've got one of the new pistons here. Now what you want to do is you just want to take the ring and get it into the bore here. You want to get it into the bore, and we are going to square that up with the piston. We're going to square it up with the piston. Sometimes you can put a lower ring on this and do it, but I'm just going to line this up with the top of that ring groove. I can see where it's at. That's pretty square. And then we want to look at our gap here. Now that gap is not very big. It's actually pretty small. It's designed so that the gap will be as small as possible to stop blow-by, but also we need it big enough to handle expansion, because if it's not big enough to handle expansion, the ends of the rings will butt into each other and it causes a major engine failure. So we got to make sure this is right. So we're going to take our feeler gauge set here, and of course we're going to check all of these, but I'm just going to do one to demonstrate. We're going to take our feeler gauge set here, and we want to measure that gap. We're just going to start with 10 thousandths and see what we got. So 10 thousandths is easily going into that gap. So then we're going to go up to 13. 13 is going in, so we definitely have 13 thousandths end gap. Okay, it's going in. Let's go to 14, and then once we get the end gap checked, I'll talk to you about the specs and what it should be. 14's going in. See if 15 goes in here. 15 is going in, but it's tight. It's not really even going in all the way. It's going in about halfway. So I'm going to say we got 14. Well, actually 15 is, yeah, 15's going in. It's in. it's just tight, but it goes in. So I'm going to assume that 16 does not. Let's see what we got here. Let's see if 16 goes. 16 definitely does not go in there. So we have about 15 thousandths end gap. Now let's talk about what that means as far as the specs go. It says that our ring end gap should be anywhere, boy, they leave it wide open, between 7 and 15 thousandths. I like to see that a little on the bigger side, and we got 15, so we're within specs. And the 15 was kind of tight, so that's really good. And that's from Plymouth. This is original reproduction of the original factory service manual. So our end gap is good. Now, off camera, I'm going to check all of those. But I want to get the first set of rings on this piston and show you how we do it first. So as far as the compression rings go, you guys, it's very important that you don't roll these on. I've seen guys on YouTube doing this. And I even had one guy getting a big argument with me saying that this certain place built a performance engine. These guys are rolling the rings on in this high performance engine build. I don't care what kind of engine they're building or who's building it. You should never roll cast iron or steel rings on. There's no manufacturer in the world that says that that's okay. Just because somebody does it doesn't mean it's all right. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes some of these rings are directional, so we want to go with our second ring here, and you want to look at it real close, because a lot of times, I don't know how well you can see that, but there is a dot right there on that ring that has a dot on it. The dot always goes up, and so we don't want to twist these and roll them on. What you need to do is you need to get yourself a set of ring pliers. These are called ring expander pliers. Now you only want to expand this just far enough to get it over the piston. Don't reef these pliers wide open. Make sure your dot's facing up, and just take your piston. I like to just set the ring on top of the piston here and just expand it just enough to get it over, get it down on the second groove. If you expand it just enough to get it over the piston, you're not going to break the ring. They're able to expand that much. So there's your second ring, and then of course our top ring, we want to take a look at our top ring. Now on the top ring, what I noticed is there's no dot. If there's no dot on the ring, it will go either way. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it says the word top on it. Some manufacturers like Total Seal, they have a part number etched into the ring, and they'll tell you the part number goes up. But in a situation like this with Hastings rings, I know, I've read the instructions and I've talked to them enough to know that if it doesn't have a dot, then it doesn't matter which way it goes. It's not a non-directional ring. So same thing, we're just going to expand this ring just enough to get it over the piston, right, into the groove, and there you go. And that's how you do it. And then of course when we put these in, we want to make sure that we stagger these. We don't want them lined up. Okay, so that's basically it for the piston, the full floating piston assembly as far as the orientation of the rings go. I'm going to do the rest of them off camera and get them ready, and then we'll start talking about the rest of the engine, the valve train and so forth, and getting the crankshaft in it and stuff like that. So once I get to that point, we'll move on. All right, one other thing here, guys. I want to talk to you about putting the bearings in the small end of the rod here, or the big end of the rod, I should say. You don't want to clamp this thing into a vise, at least not a bench vise. What you want is you need to have a rod vise. This is a rod vise. Now you can buy rod vises. I fabricated this one, right, out of a couple of bars and some studs and so forth. But anytime you chuck up on a connecting rod, you want to make sure that you chuck up on the big end of the rod here where it's machined. Never chuck up on the beam of the rod or on the small end of the rod and try to loosen or tighten these bolts down here, because I'm telling you, you will bend the connecting rod. You have to be real careful about that. So we're going to check up on the machined area at the bottom, and then we're going to get our bolts off of there and install our bearings. It's okay to loosen these bolts up here, and these are torqued on because these have been resized. It's okay to loosen these up with some kind of a power driver. I have a little Makita driver. It's okay to take these off, but never put them on with this. And actually that's not going to do it because they're torqued more than what that little guy can handle. So we're going to take and get those off by hand. Just going to break them loose here by hand, and once I get them broken loose, then we can run these off with this guy. Take the rod nuts off, and once you get the rod nuts off of there, some of these can be kind of stubborn. This is another good reason for having a rod vise. I mean, you can try to pull that off. Now this one came off pretty easy, but you can put this in the vise and check up on the cap and pull this off if you need to. So that is your cap and your rod assembly. So now we've got our new bearings that we got from Andy Birnbaum, and we're just going to go ahead and install our bearings in here. And then of course we want to check our clearances. We want to make sure our clearances are correct. These are the right bearings for what we're doing, so the clearances should be right. And your bearing locating notch is here. You want to line that up with the notch in the cap. Now it's very important that you don't mix these caps up. They need to stay with their respective rods, so we're going to go ahead and just put this back on. And even if we don't check the clearances or anything, we want to have this on here. Now we are going to check the clearance on this just to make sure that we're good to go. So we're going to take and put the nuts back on, and we're going to torque them to specs. So we got our bearing in there, we got our cap on the correct way. It's always a good idea to put a little bit of oil on these before you torque them. Now the torque spec on the connecting rod is 45 foot-pounds. So we're going to run these down, and then we're going to torque them in a couple of steps to 45. So just run those up until they're snug. And you want to torque these evenly. We're going to snug them up there, and we'll grab our torque wrench and we'll torque them in 2 steps. I like to go to 30 and then to 45. The service manual says 45 to 50. I don't think 50 is really necessary on these. It's the same size fastener as a small block Chevy. It's a 3/8, and they're perfectly fine at 45. So we'll go to 35 first of all, and we'll snug these evenly. There's 35, and then we'll go to 45 just to finish it off. And once we get the fastener torqued to its final torque value, we're going to measure our clearance on this just to make sure that it's right. Now I'm going to do them all, but I'm going to show you how to do one on camera, because these are issues, especially with these older motors. You can't skip any of this. You got to make sure that this stuff is exactly right. So we've got our bearing torqued in there, we've got this torqued to spec, we oiled these up, and now we're going to measure our crankshaft. We're going to measure the crankshaft journal that this goes on. That's our number 1 connecting rod. This is our fresh crankshaft right next to the old crankshaft. So we're just going to take a mic reading on this guy, and we're going to use that reading as a reference for our clearance. Reading on that journal. We'll lock it in place. and that's the size of our journal there. It is 1 inch 907 is what that's reading. 1 inch 907, and it makes sense that that's 30 under because the standard size is 937. So 937, it's reading 907. It is exactly 30 under. All right, so now we've got that locked, and we're going to take that reading and we're going to use it. Okay guys, so now that we've duplicated the size of our rod journal here, this is a dial bore gauge. Now we're going to take the gauge, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to, we have to calibrate this, so I'm going to take the size of the journal that I mic'd here. God, this fly is bugging the heck out of me. Get out of here. And then I'm going to just set my dial bore gauge up so that I can zero it out for this size, and that way when I put it in the bore I'll be able to see it. So I'll put the indicator up here so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm basically going to measure this indicator, and you can see, we'll put this in here, we have got that thing right on 0. So what I did is I duplicated the size of my journal with this on 0. Now we're just going to take our piston and rod assembly, and we're going to put the dial bore gauge right inside of our bearing clearance here, and we should be able to see our clearance. So I'm going to put this in here and I'll show you what the dial says. We'll get it in there. Go to the smallest point there, and if you can see that, it's right at about 2 thousandths. So 2 to 2.5 is what we should have, and we have 2 thousandths, which is perfect. So, and that's how you do it. So you just mic the journal that this is going to go on, and keep in mind when you check these, you need to check each journal. So I'm going to remic each journal. Like with number 2, I'm going to go mic the number 2 journal, and then I'm going to check, I'm going to set my dial bore gauge for that size, and I'm going to check the rod that goes on number 2. So it's important that you do that to make sure that all the clearances are right. I'm going to go ahead and do all the clearances on all 6 of the cylinders, and I'm going to do the mains. When we get to the mains, I'll show you how to do that. Obviously, again, I'm not going to do all 6 on camera. That would just be silly. So I'll get that done, and then we'll move on to the next step.